Alright, everybody, this is AW, here to read something which I'm surprised is not on the internet in any recorded form yet. Despite how popular this is, everybody talks about Kojeve and Hegel, and it seems nobody cares, which is weird to me. You know, there's lectures about Kojeve and Hegel, but there's no one, you know, there's audiobooks of the Phenomenology of Spirit and the Science of Logic, for fuck's sake, but nobody apparently has ever wanted to actually read Kojeve's lectures on the introduction to the Phenomenology of Spirit. Actually, the text itself is called The Introduction to the Reading of Hegel, Lectures on the Phenomenology of Spirit by Alexander Kojeve, and these are not completed this is not a complete set of lectures, as far as I'm aware. There's only some excerpt lectures which comprise part of this translations, but these, I'm not sure. Actually, I wouldn't be surprised at all if these aren't the total amount of works which someone as extensively well read and influential and probably a heavy writer himself, as Kojeve is. I'm pretty sure this pithy amount of text and translations don't amount to the extent to what is actually available in the French. Now, I can read about like 70% of French, but I don't care enough to learn French just to read Kojeve or Hippolyte. Just a historical note, everybody blames Kojeve for what is really to be blamed in Hippolyte. You know, people are like, isn't, you know, like the reaction against Hegel because of Kojeve? Actually, no. Most of it is because of Hippolyte. And Hippolyte is kind of considered you know, unlike Kojeve, who's a persona non grata in Hegelian circles nowadays, Hippolyte is considered, you know, respectable. His reading of Hegel is, as far as I've read, not too far off the track. You know, it's he's unlike Kojeve, who focused a lot on the phenomenology. Hippolyte went back to the logic, and it's to Hippolyte that most of the reaction against Hegel comes from in the French philosophical circles. And even then, you know, once you understand certain things, you're kind of like, well, I don't even understand how they got that from Hippolyte, you know. But whatever. Let's get to this. I'm not going to read this in order. There's certain chapters that I really, really like. I read this the first time, or actually no, the second time I went to Yosemite National Park with a friend from work, and I took the public bus, so I had a good few hours to just sit there in silence, and so I read it on my phone, and it was bomb. Actually, when did so Alexander Kojeve lived from 1902 to 1968? Really? Look that up, Rain. I'm surprised by that. I thought he was born earlier, and 1968 does seem like about the time that he died, but I don't think he was that young. That doesn't make sense to me. Anyways, here's some quotes by Hegel before the book begins. Gentlemen, we find ourselves in an important epoch, in a fermentation in which spirit has made a leap forward, has gone beyond its previous concrete form and acquired a new one. The whole mass of ideas and concepts that have been current until now, the very bonds of the world, are dissolved and collapsing into themselves like a vision in a dream. A new emergence of spirit is at hand. Philosophy must be the first to hail its appearance and recognize it, while others, resisting impotently, adhere to the past, and the majority unconsciously constitute the matter in which it makes its appearance. But philosophy, in recognizing it as what is eternal, must pay homage to it. Hegel, Lectures at Jena of 1806, final speech. You know, people complain, like, oh, Hegel's such a terrible writer, you know, he was probably really boring. Have you read about that, Rain? About, like, how Hegel apparently was just a fantastic lecturer, one of the best. I mean, there's a reason like his classes were popular, and it's not because of his fucking books or essays.
I actually haven't read about that. I know Schopenhauer, in that time, you actually got paid by people paying to go to certain lectures. And so Schopenhauer, competing with Hegel, would schedule his lectures at the same time. So that wasn't just a popularity contest. Schopenhauer wanted to like take away his money. Like he was being seriously antagonistic to Hegel, but apparently Hegel just wiped the floor as far as getting people to attend his Schopenhauer. Very few attended. And I wasn't aware that he was an amazing lecturer, but it's not difficult for me to imagine. I could imagine, seems to me it would probably be electric.
I mean, like, with quotes like this, I totally believe it. Absolutely believe it. I mean, if I had lectures like this when I was in college, like, philosophy probably would have been a religious experience, in the classroom.
Yeah, I find when Hegel's being technical, it's because he has to be technical. There's no avoiding it. But he often inserts all kinds of like wonderfully poetic flourishes. Like he definitely has a knack. And what's obtuse is just because the content is difficult itself. Usually.
Yep. Next quote. The courage of truth, faith in the power of spirit are the first condition of philosophy. Man, because he is spirit, can and must consider himself worthy of everything that is most sublime. He can never overestimate the greatness and power of his spirit. And if he has this faith, nothing will be so recalcitrant and hard as not to reveal itself to him. Hegel, 1816. All right. So, we're going to skip to Chapter 4, Philosophy and Wisdom, which is page 75. All right. Chapter 4, Philosophy and Wisdom. First lecture. In the first 7 chapters of the Phenomenology, Hegel talked about philosophy. In chapter 8, he is going to be concerned with something else. When I say this, I use the term philosophy in the precise, proper, narrow sense. I am talking about philosophy, the love of wisdom, the aspiration to wisdom, as opposed to sophia, to wisdom itself. Now, in chapter 8, Hegel is no longer talking about the philosopher, but about the wise man, about wisdom, for the absolute knowledge with which this chapter is concerned is nothing other than wisdom opposed to philosophy, and to theology as well as vulgar science. Before beginning the interpretation of chapter 8, then, I would like to say a few words about wisdom in relation to philosophy. All philosophers are in agreement about the definition of the wise man. Moreover, it is very simple and can be stated in a single sentence. That man is wise who is capable of answering in a comprehensible or satisfactory manner all questions that can be asked him concerning his acts, and capable of answering in such fashion that the entirety of his answers forms a coherent discourse. Or else, what amounts to the same thing, that man is wise who is fully and perfectly self-conscious. Now, an awareness of the meaning of this definition is sufficient to make us understand why Plato, for example, denied the possibility of realizing this ideal of wisdom. It is the case that one can ask any question at all about any of our acts, that of washing, for example, or of paying taxes, with the result that after several answers that call forth each time a new why, one comes to the problems of the relationship between the soul and the body, between the individual and the state, to questions relating to the finite and the infinite, to death and immortality, to God and the world, and finally to the problem of knowledge itself, of this coherent and meaningful language that permits us to ask questions and to answer them. In short, by proceeding, so to speak, In the vertical plane, one will quickly come face to face with the entire body of the so-called philosophical or metaphysical questions. On the other hand, by setting forth from the same banal act and proceeding the horizontal plane, one will end up, less quickly of course, surveying all the sciences taught in modern universities, and perhaps one will discover still others not yet in existence. In a word, to be able to answer all questions relating to any one of our acts is, in the final analysis, to be able to answer all possible questions in general. Therefore, quote, to answer all questions, and so on, unquote, is to realize the encyclopedia of possible kinds of knowledge. To be perfectly and completely self-conscious is to have at one's disposal, at least virtually, an encyclopedic knowledge in the full sense of the word. In defining the wise man, the man of absolute knowledge, as perfectly self-conscious, that is, omniscient, at least potentially, Hegel nevertheless had the unheard of audacity to assert that he realized wisdom in his own person. When the wise man is discussed, he is usually presented in another guise, which seems more easily attainable than omniscience. Thus the Stoics, for example, for whom the idea of the wise man plays a central role, and who, in contrast to Plato, asserted the possibility and even the reality of such a man, define him as that man who is perfectly satisfied by what he is. The wise man, then, would be the man who wants nothing, who desires nothing. He wants to change nothing, either in himself or outside of himself. Therefore, he does not act. He simply is and does not become. He maintains himself an identity to himself, and he is satisfied in and by this identity. Now, for Hegel, this second definition of the wise man in terms of satisfaction is but a paraphrase of the first, the one in terms of perfect self-knowledge, and he accepts both definitions precisely because he identifies them. Of course, our object is not to prove this thesis here, for the proof of it is given by the entirety of the Phenomenology, or more exactly by its first 7 chapters. I shall only indicate that the assertion that perfect satisfaction implies and presupposes full self-consciousness is more acceptable than the inverse assertion that the man who is perfectly self-conscious is necessarily satisfied by what he is, by that of which he becomes conscious. Fundamentally, to prove the first assertion, it suffices to say this: given that one can be satisfied only by knowing that one is satisfied, only by becoming conscious of one's satisfaction, it follows that perfect satisfaction implies an absolute self-consciousness. But I do not insist on this reasoning, for I know that we moderns are much too romantic to let ourselves to be convinced by so-called easy, that is, obvious arguments. I shall then merely appeal to our psychological experience. We believe in vain that we are satisfied if someone comes and asks us the question why concerning our satisfaction, and we cannot answer this, and we cannot answer. This is enough to make the satisfaction disappear as if by enchantment, even if the sensation of pleasure or of happiness or of joy or of simple well-being resists the test for a while. Anyone can make this experiment for himself. But one can also simply read Plato's dialogue, the Ion, in which just such a man appears, one who believes he is satisfied by what he is and who ceases to be satisfied solely because he cannot justify this satisfaction in answering Socrates' questions. The scene is completely convincing. All right, footnote 1. However, a very important restriction must be made here. I believe that Plato actually succeeds in convincing all those who read and understand his dialogue. But here is a difficulty. The number of people who read Plato is limited, and the number of those who understand him is still more limited. It makes no sense, therefore, to say that the scene in question is convincing in general. It can convince, so to speak, only those who are willing to be convinced. Astute thing he notes there. I say this about Hegel as well, in which, people are like, well, I don't find this convincing. And I'm like, well, yeah, you got to be willing to be convinced, in the sense that you got to be willing to put your mind within the thought movement which Hegel's undergoing. And so long as you refuse that, Hegel's not going to make sense. That's what I think of making sense of my experience of seeing people who read Hegel and they just don't get it. And they're like, well, I get the words, he's just saying something stupid. I'm like, well, no, you're not getting it.
Yeah, one has to suspend external concerns and just deal with what Hegel's dealing with imminently in order for it to make any sense. People usually shoot themselves in the foot doing what they think is critical questioning when they haven't really apprehended what's even happening or why it's being done this way. They've basically set their own personal bar for what knowledge or knowing should look like without actually knowing in the first place. So they can't possibly be setting a good bar. Therefore, if somebody else who claims to know and perhaps actually does, they have to, de facto, consider charitably and enter imminently the thought of that other person, a kind of surrender, so to speak. But it's that's how you learn. Like, you cannot learn something if you bar the conditions of learning it by presuming to know what you don't know prior to coming to know it.
Certainly. I was actually talking with somebody on Discord earlier, and the concept of love came up, and I kept trying to instill with clarity into them the notion that they cannot oppose their intuitions and assumptions of what they think a thing is when Hegel presents something that seems different to that. Like the concept of love came up, and I offered the critique that universal love, like particularly the kind of love espoused by or put forth by a lot of mystics, like, oh, we gotta love everybody or whatever, the people who pretend to be enlightened. And the reality is that that's not love as we mean in the actual sense of the word. In practical life, there's a way in which you can mean that linguistically, but in practical life you can't actually mean it. Not even these enlightened people, not even these gurus, love everyone the way you ought to love everyone. To love someone isn't just like, oh yes, poor people out there, I care for them and my heart bleeds. But it's not the same as when if you have a child, if that child is hurting, that's not the same as the fucking hobo outside hurting, not even close. If your friend is hurting, that's not the same as, a person in China, who's let's take for granted the example of the so-called internment camps, which I don't believe in, but but let's take that. People are like, oh, but we love everybody. Yes, but you don't love the person in that internment camp like you love your friend or your family or whatever. Those people who actually matter in your life. Those people you love in the real deep sense of that. When love is reduced to just this vague notion of like, oh, I kind of sort of care and I have some sympathy, but you're not going to break the bank trying to save a stranger, trying to help them out. You do that for your friends and your family. You don't do that for a stranger. And if you did, you'd be an idiot. Not every stranger, you don't know that stranger. You don't have a personal connection. You don't know if they're worth helping. We give like $5 or whatever, every once in a while because it's out of charity, but we're not going to break the bank like that. And my point about that to her was like, there's a certain meaning to love which we lose when we just accept this more vague definition. And if you feel comfortable about that, which she did, it's merely because you have an attachment to this word meaning something when in fact it doesn't mean much if you actually mean that. If all we mean by love is just like, oh, well, the general caring sympathy, and even empathy for people, it doesn't have the same depth of neither linguistic meaning nor existential meaning, in which when you communicate that, if that's what we mean, you're not communicating like the real things where, when you say, I really love this, that's not conveyed but in that concept, if what we mean is just that more general, vague concept. And this is a problem with the modern day in general, in which vague concepts are what people really gravitate to. We have that current situation in which nobody wants to exclude anybody out of anything, so they don't want to define things in a way that exclude and make distinctions, because then by necessity you must exclude that which doesn't fit into that. And I don't know, to me that doesn't bother me, but to a lot of people it does. And they begin reading Hegel and they're like, well, he says this thing and I just don't agree. I'm like, why don't you agree about it? And they're like, well, I don't think love is like that. Well, why do you think love is like that? What are you talking about? And when you actually suss out what they're talking about and compare to what Hegel's talking about, two things have to become apparent. They're not talking about the same thing at all, or they're talking about the thing that they do accept, and it's just restricting the word for a far more specific meaning, rather than a vague general meaning. And once you accept that, the whole problem of misunderstanding disappears. Because then you're not fighting it. You're like, but I don't think love is like that. Well, forget about what you think. Just go with what is being said. Does it make sense? Does it apply to the world as you understand it? Whether you agree with the restriction of that or not, or whether you want it to be that way or not, doesn't really matter. And then that's not just for Hegel, but that's just for anybody, right? You read Plato and you might not agree with Plato, you might not agree with Deleuze or whatever, but you got to give them their due, and that they're talking about something specific. And if you understand it, the only problem you could possibly have is well, I just don't like that word usage, whatever. But then that's literally pointless. That's an empty argument right there. It's literally just aesthetic in a very vapid sense.
I agree with that. Happens all too often.
Anyway, let's continue. Generally speaking, there is a tendency to underestimate the difficulties of satisfaction and to overestimate those of omniscience. Accordingly, the thinkers who, on the one hand, believe in the myth of easy satisfaction, a myth invented by moralists, and on the other hand, preserve the ideal of the wise man and know that it is extremely difficult to realize, have in mind neither omniscience, which they believe to be unattainable, nor satisfaction, which they believe too easy, but a third definition. They identify wisdom with moral perfection. Hence, the wise man would be the morally perfect man. Hegel believes he can show that this third definition equals the second and consequently the first. I do not believe that anyone can seriously contest the assertion that the perfect man is satisfied by what he is. Even Christians are obliged to make this assertion once they identify holiness with perfection, and not as they usually do, either with a minimal imperfection, a minimum of sin, or on the contrary, with the maximum consciousness of imperfection, of sin. Therefore, whoever speaks of moral perfection necessarily also speaks of satisfaction by what one is. To understand why this is so, we need only reflect on the very concept of moral perfection, abstracting from its content. With regard to this content, opinions can diverge. There has been much discussion of the content of the morality that the wise man is supposed to realize perfectly, but this does not interest us for the moment. It is sufficient to note this. Either the concept of moral perfection has no meaning, or else it must be understood as a human existence that serves as the model for all men, the final end and motive of their actions being conformity to this model. If, then, the wise man realizes moral perfection in his person, we must say that his existence serves as the model both for himself and for others. He wants to resemble himself indefinitely, and the others want to resemble him. Now, this is equivalent to saying that the wise man is satisfied by what he is. He is satisfied subjectively in himself, since there is nothing in him that urges him to go beyond himself, to change, that is, to negate, not to accept what he already is. And he is objectively satisfied by the universal recognition, for no one would want to force him to change the state that satisfies him. I said that the concept of moral perfection is meaningful only provided that it is universally valid. that is, accepted as the model by all men. This may appear debatable, given that we have got into the habit of talking about several irreducible existential types, that is, several essentially different moralities, and of course I have no intention of disputing this pluralism, that is, this ethical relativism. I only wanted to say that, in these conditions, it is no longer meaningful to speak of perfection, for in this case the concept of perfection is strictly identical to that of subjective satisfaction. In effect, to assert the plurality of existential or moral types is to assert that recognition by all men is not implied in the ideal of the perfection realizable within each of these types. Therefore, oh no, I lost my, where was I? Perfection. Therefore, one need only believe oneself perfect in order to be perfect. Now, to believe that one is perfect is obviously to be satisfied by what one is. Inversely, to be satisfied by what one is obviously to believe that one is perfect. That is, in the case which we are considering, to be perfect. Hence, it is solely by asserting that there is only one type of moral perfection that one completes the concept of satisfaction when one speaks of the perfection of the satisfied man. Namely, one completes the concept of subjective satisfaction by that of objective satisfaction, that is, of satisfaction by universal recognition. But as I said, even in this case one must say that the truly perfect man is satisfied by what he is. It is only the inverse assertion that appears debatable. It seems possible to be satisfied without being willing and able to serve as the model for all others. I have already said that I cannot reproduce the Hegelian proof of the theory that the satisfied man is morally perfect, that is, that he serves as the model to all others. I shall only mention that Hegel succeeds in proving this by showing that man can be satisfied only by being universally recognized. That is, he shows that man can be satisfied only by being perfect, and that he is perfect, moreover, only by being satisfied. And he manages to do this by identifying man with self-consciousness. This is to say that here again the argument is convincing only for those who are willing to be convinced, who are open to conviction by reason. In other words, Hegel only shows that the first definition of the wise man by self-consciousness coincides with the definitions by satisfaction and by moral perfection. But he proves nothing at all to the man who denies the first definition, that is, who denies that the wise man must be self-conscious. The only thing that Hegel can say is that to those who deny it, nothing at all can be proved. To put it otherwise, he does not succeed in showing that the satisfied man is actually taken as the model by all men. He only proves what is obvious from the start, that the fully satisfied and perfectly self-conscious man serves as the morally perfect model for all those who put the supreme existential value in self-consciousness. That is, for those who, by definition, accept the ideal that this man realizes. Now, I don't know about you, but I think this is actually an interesting argument, which I haven't really read anybody else bring up. I've seen other people mention something similar to this, but they don't focus on it like this, in which, like, people are like, how can Hegel be right? There's people who disagree. And, the point is, yeah, and, people are stupid. people can have different bases which are still leave them relative. For anybody who follows an absolute form of reasoning, Hegel makes sense. For anybody who doesn't, they despair and they hate what Hegel says, because it's not on the basis of what they begin with and what they think.
Yeah, they presume out the gate that Hegel's thinking is finite. And that all thinking is finite, and therefore you can't have an absolute thinking. The irony here is that this is an absolute declaration about the nature of thought. One would have to have perfect apprehension of the nature of all things in order to say that they truly are all finite in that manner.
Yep. So let's see. At first glance, then, Hegel's argument is a simple tautology, and it seems that for him too there is an irreducible pluralism which deprives the concept of perfection of its meaning, but Hegel would not accept this interpretation. He would say his concept of perfection is valid, since it is universally valid, as is every concept. Those who reject it have no concept at all. Oh man, people hate when I tell them that. People hate, like, how dare you, to just assume that your concept is right. I'm like, you don't have a concept. Sorry, your concept is a pseudo concept.
Yeah, or the rejection of your concept is actually involves the concept you're employing in order to produce the comparison of like the truth and falsity. It's like, that's what I was already saying. You are, yeah, just self-undermining all over the place.
Like gender is a good example. There's so many definitions of gender, and like, you could try to reason with these people imminently and show how these concepts just undermine themselves. It's not too difficult, but it's an almost endless and hopeless battle, and they won't accept that they have an incoherent concept, which is not a concept at all, because what you do with such concepts ends up not showing, like, oh well, here's the truth of that concept. In a positive way, it's a negative dialectic. You dissolve it, because that's all these concepts really are. They're negative self-dissolutions that fall apart the moment you start to analyze them, and they don't fall apart in a good way. They don't fall apart in a positive way. There's no way you can return to them. Not because there's no way you can conceive a return to them, but rather because the people who put them forth lose what it is that they wanted out of it, by trying to stick it and force it into a single one-sided moment. And once you shift out of that moment and it becomes alien to them, and even if you do the return back, you're like, okay, we can integrate that moment that you had into a higher conception, and they don't like it because it's not what they wanted. To them, it's not a matter of like, what does this really mean? What could we really mean by this? But it's like, I want this to mean this. I want art to be this thing. I don't care what it is. I want it to be. Art is good. Another good example. I think probably a better example actually, in which nowadays anything and everything is art. Why? Because people are like, oh well, I think it's beautiful, and all these other things. And what the fuck does that mean? Once you suss it out of them, like, it ends up meaning stupid bullshit like, well, it makes me feel things. Nothing even specifically, like, nobody knows what they mean by beauty nowadays. It's just like, well, everybody says the word, and I've grown up hearing this word, and I have a certain attachment to this word now, and everybody feels that it's special, and so I feel it's special. And so if I say that taking a turd on the street is a beautiful thing, and that's art, and that the reason that's art is because at least it gave me a reaction. It made me feel something, even if it made me that something was making me feel like puking. But that's what art is for me. Isn't that beautiful? Well, I say those people, you don't have a concept of art at all. You're a moron. It doesn't mean anything. You can't determine anything specific about the domain of art with that. Everything becomes art. Everything gives you a fucking reaction.
The fairness I will extend to the confusions of the understanding is they're always gripping something partial, but the partiality is why it falls apart. And it's the clinging to that partiality that produces the endless contradictions and self-elements and confusions and vagaries, transition into externalities and things like that. It's a circus, kind of, but they're clinging to something that they have justified conviction as being a real element of some sort, but they're confused about the nature of that element. And so you get visceral reactions to demonstrations of these contradictions and so on, and as well as the resolutions and resolvings that one puts forth dialectically.
Yeah. Alright, continuing. While discussing the second definition of the wise man, we already found ourselves in an analogous situation, and I said that we would have to discuss it. The moment has come for this. We have seen that for Hegel the three definitions of wisdom are rigorously equivalent. The wise man is the perfectly self-conscious man, that is, the man who is fully satisfied by what he is, that is, the man who realizes moral perfection by his existence, or in other words, who serves as the model for himself and for all others. This means, and this restriction is important, for all those for whom he exists, that is, for those who understand him, who know that he exists, and who know what he is. For the moment, let us set aside this restriction. The wise man, then, is universally recognized. This is to say that there is only one possible type of wisdom. In making this assertion, we run into the contrary thesis of pluralism or existential relativism. How does Hegel manage to prove his thesis? In point of fact, he can prove it only by starting from the first definition of wisdom, put as an axiom. As for the proof, it is very simple. Let us admit that the wise man is perfectly self-conscious. We have seen that perfect self-consciousness equals omniscience. In other words, the wise man's knowledge is total. The wise man reveals the totality of being through the entirety of his thought. Now, since being obeys the principle of identity to itself, there is only one unique totality of being, and consequently only one unique knowledge that reveals it entirely. Therefore, there is only one unique possible type of conscious wisdom. I'm sure that people who don't understand the logic of recognition definitely would not buy this argument.
Yeah, a lot of people get hung up there. Inners and outers. Oh boy.
No, I mean, but just to go with that, this does make sense if you're familiar with the logic of recognition. This identity of wisdom, omniscience, wisdom, self-consciousness, omniscience, self-satisfaction, absolute, complete satisfaction, perfection, moral perfection, and universal recognition on the conceptual level. That syllogistic analogy and identity does work, as far as I'm concerned.
I agree.
Now, if the ideal of self-conscious wisdom is unique, we must say that the wise man who realizes also realizes moral perfection, and consequently that he is satisfied by what he is. Therefore, it is sufficient to suppose that the wise man is fully self-conscious in order to be able to assert that self-consciousness, subjective satisfaction, and objective perfection completely coincide in wisdom, which is necessarily unique. In other words, to arrive at this threefold Hegelian definition, it is sufficient to suppose that man is self-consciousness in his very essence and being, and that it is through self-consciousness and only through self-consciousness that he differs from animals and things. Starting from this supposition, one can actually deduce the threefold definition that we are talking about. Actually, I suppose I should explain this. Okay, so I'll do a rundown for those listening. The logic of recognition is basically this. Okay, so in the Phenomenology, there's a section starts that there's a weird section on life right before self-consciousness. Most people have no idea what it means, and it has to do with a lot of things, but it's just a very weird syllogistic progression that doesn't make sense unless you're familiar with the way Hegel thinks. And then it's kind of awkward, but it does make sense. But the end of that section is in which there is a mode of consciousness called desire first, which beholds objects. Desire is this negative relationship in which its satisfaction is the active negation of whatever object is before consciousness, because what consciousness wants as self-consciousness is self-certainty. And self-certainty is achieved when consciousness asserts that it is the absolute, and the way desire realizes its claim to absoluteness and self-certainty, that it is the absolute, it is to destroy anything or negate anything which comes before it and presents an opposition or challenge. We then have this dual development of desire in the mode of a living organism, in which the living organism has an inorganic begins with an inorganic body, then has development into organic division and subsumption into, a multi-organism. Hegel then analogizes this to the genus and the species relationship. But then when we have this system of a self-producing life form, we have the form of an infinite. And Hegel's argument there is like, okay, well, since prior in the Phenomenology, we already had the relationship of infinity in which whenever anything infinite happens, it has to be mirrored. So if life is infinite, self-conscious, desire is also infinite and shares, and there's a mirror relationship in which they share an equal nature. So then the living thing becomes a living desire, and desire also itself becomes a living desire. But desire is satisfied only by negation. And the key here is that desire is satisfied by negation. It is never specified in the beginning that it must be a negation of a specific kind or from a specific desire. Because, and this is existentially like, you can prove this existentially in that like there's plenty of things that we don't negate. They're negated and they please us. They satisfy us. So negation itself is just what satisfies desire. It's not necessary that desire itself be the one negating anything. So when desire is a living thing is negating itself in its process of living and self-reproducing and blah, blah, blah. This is an instantiated mode of freedom. And this is what recognition is. When desire, a living desire faces a living desire, that is the only time, that is the only moment in which desire is fully satisfied, in which desire no longer lacks a thing that will, just be a momentary desire. You eat a pizza, that's only for that moment. You're happy for that moment, that's it. And then you're craving again, you desire again. You go and hike a mountain, that's only for a moment. You're done, and then you're going to crave it again. Anything finite is just going to keep on creating a craving. Not only that, it gets, in the act of doing it, it gets consumed in many ways. But a living desire, another person cannot be consumed. And the ultimate desire is not in the consumption of them. The ultimate desire is literally in just letting them be. When you love, and this leads to recognition, which is also the immediacy of love, in an intuitive sense, in which when you love, what you love to be free. Like it's not really this obsessive, possessive kind of love, even though for many people it becomes an obsession and therefore deviates, and it's completely unsatisfying because they're always in utter fear of losing that thing they love, because they cannot let it be free. So they're not properly self-conscious, they're not properly recognitive, because what satisfies them is still a mode of consumption, rather than just like the pleasure of just the self-negation of the other. If you are in a relationship, what pleases you is not that your partner or your lover obeys you and just does whatever you command. What pleases you is that they want to please you. They do it of their own will. They do it freely. That's more pleasing than having a slave. And that doesn't run out. Because there is no the source of that generation is infinite. It's a living thing. Desire is infinite. It posits infinite amount of things you could desire, and when you have a relationship of a desire to a desire, a mutual desiring in love or what have you, it forms an infinite circuit. There's no running out of there. So long as you recognize each other, so long as you behold each other as the object of desire, there's no running out of it. It's perfect, and Hegel says this is the only thing which truly satisfies desire. Ultimately, it's the one thing that is inexhaustible. It is the one thing that can never be destroyed. It will never be lost, at least not by any act of desire. It literally just does itself. You don't have to be afraid of it doing anything or leaving or disappearing, because the pleasure is in its own free being. That being said, okay, that's a long-winded thing. So that leads to the self-consciousness, satisfaction, identity. How that then leads to the moral perfection identity is because all morality is ultimately a concrete form, or has to be a concrete form, particularly in ethical life, of recognition. Someone who recognizes absolutely is someone who also has this recognition, not just with the immediacy of the lover, but with the whole human community at large. And this is instantiated in many forms of social relationships and objectifications. So that leads to the morally perfect individual, and then the and the perfectly self-conscious, as wise, as conceptually knowing, omniscient individual. That comes tied in, because then the person who perfectly recognizes doesn't just recognize self-consciousness, doesn't just recognize social norms, doesn't just recognize morality, doesn't just recognize politics, a state, or art, or religion, or whatnot. They recognize thought, they recognize truth, and particularly the self-recognition of reason. And when you have that, the whole thing blows up into the infinity or not a spurious infinity, but a proper infinity of a reason that is absolute and therefore is complete, and is therefore omniscient in that sense. So yeah, does that cover it? I think that covered it, right? That's the three: self-consciousness, satisfaction, moral perfection, omniscience.
I think it did.
So yeah, the argument works. So continuing. Once more, I am not concerned with reproducing this deduction here, which is given the entirety of the first 7 chapters of the Phenomenology, but I shall say that it is irrefutable. I agree, Kojeve, I agree. Therefore, a reading of the first 7 chapters of the Phenomenology shows that the definition by self-consciousness is sufficient grounds for the necessary conclusion that there must be an ideal of the wise man, that there can be only one type of wise man, and that the wise man answers to the threefold Hegelian definition. At least, this is what Hegel himself would have said. But a closer examination shows that Hegel presupposes a bit more than the simple fact of the existence of self-consciousness. He supposes that this self-consciousness naturally, spontaneously tends to extend itself, to expand, to spread through the whole domain of the reality given to man and in man. As a matter of fact, the dialectical movement of the Phenomenology always takes place according to the following schema. A situation A has been constituted, and Hegel describes it. Then he says that once the situation is given, the man who realizes it must himself necessarily become conscious of it. Finally, he shows how the situation A changes as a result of this coming to consciousness and is transformed into a new situation B, and so on. Now, it is possible that the coming to consciousness in question is much less necessary, less natural, less universal than Hegel thinks. It is possible that in the normal case, man, even self-conscious man, opposes an extension of this consciousness, tends to enclose himself in it, to project into the unconscious, the automatic, and so on, everything that goes beyond the already conscious range. Now, if this is truly the case, a dialectical movement that ends in the ideal and the reality of wisdom ceases to be necessary. In order that this movement may come to its end, at each dialectical turning point there must actually be a self-consciousness that tends to extend itself to the new reality. And nothing proves that such a self-consciousness must necessarily be there at the moment when it is needed. Well, he's right about this, that, although I think he's wrong to attribute this to Hegel. Hegel doesn't think that any individual must necessarily become self-conscious in any situation. He just thinks it's a it's a logical necessity, which also has shown itself to be an empirical actuality. Not only has there been the chance to be self-conscious, but clearly some people do become self-conscious and of the situation, and they transcend the moment. And I think this actually this little model he has about becoming conscious of the situation is very true to what goes on with the logic of Hegel and everywhere. how do you get to becoming, or how do you get from being to nothing, and then nothing to being, and then those two to becoming? Each one is, you do an act of cognition, you become self-conscious, you step back, you look upon that act of cognition, and then you notice something about it. You try to think being is empty, there's nothing there, you can't think, and you're like, oh, well, that's the same thing, I have a word for that, certain name in there, and it's called nothing. It's not being, it's nothing. And then you stand back from nothing again, like, wait a minute, but if it is nothing, well, at least it is an emptiness, an indeterminacy that's present. It is, it's immediate. Therefore it is, you become self-conscious of that situation. And then you go, well, I have this thought process of, I think being, I get shifted to nothing. I think nothing, I immediately get shifted to being. This seems to be an ongoing process, but, normally you would think that if you have a thought, you just have that thought. But clearly my thoughts are moving, so something more is going on. And then the self-consciousness of that is what we call becoming. And then becoming has its own new mode of activation. You do it, and then you become self-conscious of it again, and then you do, and you become self-conscious of it again, and then at the end you do it again, and you become self-conscious of that doing, and you get existence or determinate being, and you just keep doing it and doing it and doing it. And the same thing happens in the phenomenology. You do something, and you're supposed to step back after you do it and notice what you've done, and that's the process which builds upon itself in sublation and everything else. So it's I think it's an intuitive description of method. Continuing. Therefore, for the deductions of the phenomenology to be valid, it is necessary to suppose not only a self-consciousness, but also a self-consciousness that always has a tendency to extend itself. A tendency to extend itself as much as possible. This supplementary condition is, in my opinion, very important. I shall come back to it shortly. For the moment, I would simply like to say that, in my opinion, the discussion can only turn on the premises of the phenomenology and not on the deductions found in it. Personally, I believe that if the premises of the phenomenology are accepted, no objection can be made to the conclusions that Hegel draws from them. In any case, up to now I have heard of no serious objection of this kind. To accept the starting point necessarily leads to the final result, that is, to the concept of the wise man in his threefold definition. I think I generally agree with that if you start where Hegel starts, you kind of get locked into where he goes. Except, somebody might say, well, in this place I would have made, I don't like the concept that he goes to, I would have shifted to another concept. And that is technically doable if you abstract from a certain kind of mediation, which can be shown to be there. Why is it that from becoming we don't jump straight to infinity? It has the right shape. You can then consider a lot of things, or you can go straight into infinity, infinitude. But then you would be missing all these other little moments in which then they're categories that we have to understand reality. Existence, reality, negation, something other, being for other, being in itself, determination, constitution, limit, and then finitude as such. If you jump from becoming all the way to infinity, you'd lose that mediating ground, which makes infinity make even more sense in the ways that we talk about it and use it, and in the ways in which it makes sense to use it, rather than just a brute jump from one analogous form to another. It's too abstract, and so I think that if anybody tries to do what Hegel does and skip to a different kind of category, what happens is you get an abrupt abstraction in which the explanatory power is just nowhere near as good, in my opinion. Although I wouldn't say it's an opinion. I think you could show that it is a fact that it just wouldn't be that explanatory. Continuing. But we must not forget that the final result of the phenomenology has a double aspect. On the one hand, Hegel deduces the threefold ideal of the wise man. On the other hand, he asserts that this ideal is realized, namely by himself, that is, by the author of the deduction in question. Now, it is obvious that the deductions of the phenomenology can only prove the ideal possibility, so to speak, of the wise man. But the phenomenology cannot prove the real possibility of the wise man, and still less his very reality. In fact, Plato, who starts with the same supposition as Hegel, that man equals self-consciousness, recognizes to be sure that the wise man whom we have in view is the necessary ideal of thought, or better, of discourse. But he denies that this ideal can be realized by man. This means by real man, by living in a real world during the length of time limited by his birth and his death. Now, since we have here a question of reality, that is, of fact, Hegel can refute Platonist skepticism only by pointing to a fact. I shall return to the question of the reality of the wise man. For the moment, I want to talk about theoretical difficulties, so to speak, by developing the remarks that I already made above and promised to come back to. We have seen that one can ask not only the question of fact, but also the question of right. One can cast doubt on Plato's, Hegel's starting point, that is, on the identification of man in self-consciousness, and on the assertion that self-consciousness always tends to extend itself as much as possible. To be sure, the deduction of the phenomenology is not hypothetical, for without a doubt, self-consciousness is not an arbitrary axiom that can be denied, but an undebatable fact. However, it can be interpreted differently. One can deny that self-consciousness reveals man's essence, or else in simple language one can say either that self-consciousness is a sort of sickness that man must and can surmount, or that alongside of conscious men there are unconscious men who are nevertheless just as human, although in a different way. Now, by doing this, one denies the universality of wisdom, which means one challenges the identity of the three definitions of the wise man. Now, the denial of the Hegelian identification of satisfaction, perfection, with self-consciousness was by no means invented by me. It has actually been made. One need only call to mind the Hindu thinkers who say that man approaches satisfaction, perfection in dreamless sleep, that satisfaction, perfection is realized in the absolute night of the fourth state, Turiya, of the Brahmins, or in nirvana, in the extinction of all consciousness of the Buddhist. Generally speaking, one need only think of all those who seek satisfaction, perfection in absolute silence, who exclude even monologue or dialogue with God. One can think, too, of the ideal that Nietzsche called Chinese, the ideal of the citizen, in the non-Hegelian sense of the term, who is made completely brutish, in and by the security of his well-being. Finally, one can think of the ideal of salvation through erotic or aesthetic unconscious ecstasy, for example, musical ecstasy. Now, there is no doubt that men have been satisfied in unconsciousness, since they have voluntarily remained in identity to themselves until their death. And if you like, one can say that they have realized moral perfection, or a moral perfection, since there have been men who took them as the model. The word perfection is then used improperly, since the universality of the ideals of the wise men no longer plays any role. Incidentally, Nietzsche seriously engaged the possibility that the ideal that he called Chinese might become universal, and this does not seem to be absurd. It is possible if it is not opposed, and then one could speak of a satisfied perfection in the proper sense of the word. Well, these are facts that are brought in opposition to Hegel, and obviously he can make no answer. He can at best oppose the fact of the conscious wise man to the facts of unconscious wise men, and if this fact did not exist, in any case, by definition, Hegel cannot convert the unconscious wise man. He can refute him, convert him only with speech. Now, by beginning to speak or to listen to a discourse, this wise man already accepts the Hegelian ideal. If he truly is what he is, an unconscious wise man, he will refuse all discussion. And then one could refute him only as one refutes a fact, a thing, or a beast, by physically destroying him. That's what I told all these fucking irrationalists. They're like, they try to argue, and I'm like, why are you arguing? It doesn't make any sense. Like, why would you argue? Just, you clearly, you tell me you don't believe in reason, so why are you trying to argue? And then they make some BS thing, and I'm like, no, like, if you really believe what you did, you either just shut up and kick my ass, or, laugh. You wouldn't try to engage in some kind of, like, rational discourse because you ultimately don't believe that rational discourse, is really conducive to the truth. It's just weird. That Hegel thing Hegel says famously in the Phenomenology, where about phrenology, he says, like, if you encounter somebody who really believes that man is reduced to the bones in skulls, the actual logical refutation of that is to, like, give them a good punch and fracture their skull.
Yeah, because if they're identical with a skull, there can be no, or if they're just identical with a all thinghood, then to punch them, that's only just things again. They should not be hurt by being punched.
Yep. To be sure, Hegel could say that the unconscious wise man is not truly a human being, but that would be only an arbitrary definition. This is to say, Hegelian wisdom is a necessary ideal only for a definite type of human being, namely for the man who puts the supreme value in self-consciousness, and only this man can realize this ideal. I think Kojeve was being a bit too kind there. Hegel indeed would say these people aren't human beings. At least, if you wanted to put it in the mildest Hegelian sense, you would have to say these people are not living up to the full ideality of human being.
Yeah, I think it'd be their implicit freedom is ineradicable, but it's not explicit, so it doesn't show. They eradicate the explicitness of their freedom by having it remain implicit only. Their own doing.
Yeah. So, in other words, the Platonic Hegelian ideal of wisdom is valid only for the philosopher. Now we understand better the significance of the more precise statement that I made, namely that in the Phenomenology, Hegel presupposes not only the fact that man is essentially self-conscious, but also the fact that man's self-consciousness naturally and necessarily tends to extend itself as much as possible. This more precise statement means, quite simply, that Hegel presupposes the existence of the philosopher for the dialectical movement of the Phenomenology to come to its end, marked by the idea and the realization of wisdom, of absolute knowledge. At each dialectical turning point, there must be a philosopher who is ready to become conscious of the newly constituted reality. Indeed, it is the philosopher, and only he, who wants to know at all costs where he is, to become aware of what he is, and who does not go any further before he has become aware of it. The others, although self-conscious, close themselves up within the range of things of which they have already become conscious, and remain impervious to new facts in themselves and outside of themselves. For them, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Or in other words, they stick to their principles. Also, for them, a war is always a war, and all dictatorships are alike. In short, it is not by themselves, but through the philosopher that they become aware, and even so, reluctantly, of an essential change in the situation, that is, in the world in which they live, and consequently in themselves. No, I totally agree with that. Philosophers are the forefront of the self-consciousness of history. In this sense, Marx is totally backwards. The rest of the world, yes, lives before the philosopher, but the philosopher is the one who becomes self-conscious of everything before anyone else.
Yeah. One's always already interpreted the world as they've acted in it. Presupposes a view of things, a way you think things hang together. There's no action prior to interpretation. They're always co-instantiated.
All right. Therefore, the man whom the phenomenology has in view, that is, the man who necessarily comes to the Platonic Hegelian ideal of the wise man and is supposed someday to be able to realize this ideal, is not man simply. It is solely the philosopher. We can now state the notion of philosophy precisely. If philosophy is love of wisdom, if to be a philosopher means to want to become a wise man, the wise man that the philosopher wants to become is necessarily the Platonic Hegelian wise man. That is, the perfect and satisfied man who is essentially and completely conscious of his perfection and satisfaction. Indeed, it is obvious that philosophy can be nothing other than a form of self-consciousness. If the sciences, for example mathematics, relate to the real which gives them a content, that is, a meaning, through the intermediary of space-time, philosophy relates to the real only through self-consciousness. Without this pivot of self-consciousness, so-called metaphysical philosophical speculations are just as formal, empty of content, that is, deprived of every kind of meaning, as the speculations of pure mathematics. Therefore, philosophy that is something other than a simple mental game, comparable to a card game, implies and presupposes the ideal of wisdom understood as full and perfect self-consciousness. Now we can bring the philosopher and the wise man face to face. First, if wisdom is the art of answering all questions that can be asked concerning human existence, philosophy is the art of asking them. The philosopher is the man who always ends up asking a question that he can no longer answer, and that he can answer what he wants to answer it at all costs. And that he can answer when he wants to answer it at all costs, only by ceasing to be a philosopher, without thereby becoming a wise man. That is, by answering either with something that is in contradiction with the rest of his discourse, or with an appeal to an incomprehensible and ineffable unconscious. Second, if the wise man is the man who is satisfied by what he is, that is, by that of which he becomes conscious in himself, the philosopher becomes conscious of his state of non-satisfaction. The philosopher is essentially a discontented man, which does not necessarily mean an unhappy man. And he is discontented as philosopher by the sole fact of not knowing that he is satisfied. If we want to be nasty, we can say that the philosopher is discontented because he does not know what he wants. But if we want to be just, we must say that he is discontented because he does not know what he wants. Oh, sorry, I was just taking a second thinking about that distinction of emphasis. So if we want to be nasty, we can say the philosopher is discontented because he does not know what he wants. But if we want to be just, we must say that he is discontented because he does not know what he wants. So, in the first, he thinks he knows what he wants, but he does not know it. He does not know that which he wants. In the second, he does not know what it is that he wants in the first place. He has desires like everyone else, but the satisfaction of his desires does not satisfy him as philosopher as long as he does not understand them, that is, as long as he does not fit them into the coherent whole of his discourse that reveals his existence, that is, as long as he does not justify them, generally but not necessarily. This justification takes the form of a so-called moral justification, and that is why the ideal of unconscious wisdom or satisfaction does not exist for the philosopher. The simple fact of not understanding his well-being, his pleasure, his joy, or his happiness, or even his ecstasy, would suffice to make him discontented, unsatisfied. Now, if conscious satisfaction finds expression in identity to self, consciousness of non-satisfaction provokes and reveals a change. The philosopher is the man who changes essentially, and who changes consciously. who wants to change, who wants to become and to be other than he is, and wants all this solely because he does not know that he is satisfied by what he is. Now, since self-consciousness finds expression in a discourse, logos, and since a discourse that reveals a change is called a dialectical discourse, we can say that every philosopher is necessarily a dialectician.
That was a great passage.
Dude, I'm telling you, I told you Kojeve is awesome.
That's good.
I don't get the hate, honestly. Third, if the wise man serves as the model for himself and for others, which means for philosophers, that is, for those who tend toward the ideal realized by the wise man, the philosopher is, so to speak, a negative model. He reveals his existence only in order to show that one must not be like him, to show that man wants to be not philosopher but wise man. Hence, the philosopher changes because he knows that he ought not to be and what he ought to become. In other words, he realizes a progress in his changes. Therefore, the philosopher's dialectical discourse, which reveals his change, reveals a progress, and since every revealed progress has a pedagogical value, it can be said in summary that every philosophy is necessarily, as Plato saw very well, a pedagogical dialectic or a dialectical pedagogy, which starts with the first question relative to the existence of the one who asks it, and finally ends, at least in principle, in wisdom, that is, in the answer, if only virtual, to all possible questions. No disagreement from me at all.
No, he's on fire right now.
The fact that a man has decided to read the Phenomenology proves that he loves philosophy. The fact that he understands the Phenomenology proves that he is a philosopher, since by reading and understanding it, he actually makes the consciousness he had of himself grow. As a philosopher, he is interested in himself and not interested in all those who are not philosophers, that is, those who from principle refuse to read the Phenomenology and hence to extend their self-consciousness. Leaving them to their own fate and returning to himself, the philosopher learns through the Phenomenology that, being a philosopher, he is a lover of wisdom, and it is defined in and by this book. This is to say that he learns that he wants to be a wise man, namely a perfectly self-conscious man, fully satisfied by his coming to consciousness, and thus serving as the model for all of his colleagues. And by seeing in the wise man the human ideal in general, the philosopher attributes to himself as philosopher a human value without equal, since according to him, only the philosopher can become a wise man. All right, there were a couple footnotes in the other page. Where were they? Okay, it's the footnote to the comment on philosopher as necessary dialectician is footnote. His dialectic, according to the first definition of wisdom, can be reduced in the final analysis to a series of questions relating to his existence and answers. And then footnote 3 on the progress of the philosopher. It is obvious, by the way, that if the term progress is meaningful only in relation to a conscious change, every conscious change is necessarily a progress. Indeed, given that self-consciousness implies and presupposes memory, it can be said that every change in the domain of self-consciousness means an extension of self-consciousness. Now, I do not believe that progress can be defined otherwise than in the following manner. There is progress from A to B if A can be understood from B, but B cannot be understood from A. Yeah, fair enough. Makes sense.
Distinct.
Continuing. The whole question reduces to knowing if the philosopher can truly hope to become a wise man. Hegel tells him that he can. He claims to have attained wisdom in and by the Phenomenology. But Plato says no. Man will never attain wisdom. In order to come to a decision, one must know what both of these attitudes mean. One must understand the significance of 1. The acceptance of the ideal of wisdom and the denial of its realization, Plato's case. 2. The assertion of a man who says he is a wise man. Hegel's case. Very good. Let me see where these... we're at 88. Where does this end? This ends at 100. Okay, we can read that. Second lecture. We have come to the following result. Philosophy is meaningful and has a reason for existing only in the event that it presents itself as the road leading to wisdom, or at least to the extent that it is guided by the ideal of the wise man. Inversely, acceptance of the ideal of the wise man necessarily leads to philosophy conceived as a means of attaining this ideal, or at least of directing oneself by it and toward it. With respect to the definition of the wise man and the philosopher, Plato, who marks the beginning of classical philosophy, agrees with Hegel, who marks its end. About the wise man, the only possible fundamental divergence is that which exists between Hegel and Plato. That is, while accepting the ideal of the wise man and the Platonic Hegelian definition of him, one can either assert or deny the possibility of realizing wisdom, of actually becoming a wise man after being a philosopher. Let us now see what this divergence means. Certainly one can, like Plato, deny the possibility of realizing wisdom, but then one of two things. Either the ideal of the wise man is never realized anywhere, and then the philosopher is simply a madman who claims or wants to be what one cannot be, and, what is worse, what he knows to be impossible. Or else, he is not a madman, and then his ideal of wisdom is or will be realized, and his definition of the wise man is or will be a truth. But since it cannot, by definition, be realized by man in time, it is or will be realized by a being other than man, outside of time. We all know that such a being is called God. Therefore, if with Plato one denies the possibility of the human wise man, one must either deny philosophy or assert the existence of God. Let us make this assertion and see what it means. On the one hand, truth reveals what is. On the other hand, it remains eternally identical to itself. Therefore, it reveals a being that remains in identity to itself. Now, by definition, the man who eternally remains a philosopher always changes. And since the world implies changing man, this world in its entirety also changes. Human discourse contains truth, then, only to the extent that it reveals being other than man and the world. It is true only to the extent that it reveals God, who is the only being that is perfect, satisfied, and conscious of himself, of itself, and of its perfect satisfaction. Hence, all philosophical progress is, in fact, not an anthropological, but theological progress. Wisdom for man means not perfect coming to consciousness of self, but perfect knowledge of God. The opposition between Plato and Hegel, then, is not an opposition within philosophy. It is an opposition between philosophy and theology. That is, in the final analysis, between wisdom and religion. From the subjective point of view, this opposition can be presented in the following manner. The philosopher hopes to attain wisdom, which for him is self-consciousness, through a continuous process of dialectical pedagogy, in which each step is conditioned and determined only by all the preceding steps. The religious man, on the other hand, can hope to attain wisdom, which for him is knowledge of God, only by an abrupt jump, by what is called a conversion, which is conditioned, at least in part, by an element external to the process that leads to it, and which is called revelation or grace. From the objective point of view, the same opposition can be presented in the following manner. The knowledge that the philosopher is supposed to end with can be revealed as absolute or total, that is, as entirely and definitively true, only by being revealed as circular, which means that in developing it, one ends at the point from which one started. The knowledge that the religious man ends up with, on the contrary, is absolute or total without being circular, or else, if you prefer, its circle of religious or theological knowledge is closed only by a single point, which interrupts the continuity of the line, this point being God. God is a particular being, because essentially different from the world and from man, that is nevertheless absolute and total. Hence, knowledge is total as soon as it implies a perfect understanding of God. Thus, the remainder of absolute knowledge, which deals with man and the world, can be partial, that is, open, non-circular. For the atheistic philosopher, on the other hand, circularity is the one and only guarantee of totality, that is, of the absolute truth of knowledge. Moving from knowledge to empirical reality, we can express the same opposition thus. Given that the wise man's knowledge reveals nothing other than man in the world, the reality that transforms this total and circular knowledge into truth is the universal and homogeneous state. Homogeneous here means free from internal contradictions, from class strife, and so on. Therefore, the philosopher can attain absolute knowledge only after the realization of this state, that is to say, after the completion of history. For the religious man, on the other hand, the universal and homogeneous reality that proves his total knowledge to be true is not the state, but God, who is supposed to be universal and homogeneous at any moment whatsoever of the historical evolution of the world and man. Hence, the religious man can attain his absolute knowledge at any historical moment whatsoever, in any real conditions. For this to take place, it is sufficient that God reveal himself to, or in and by, a man. Right, footnote 4. I do not dwell on these questions at great length, because I shall not have to talk about them in my in my commentary on chapter 8. I should only like to mention that the history of philosophy does indeed confirm this way of looking at things, namely that to deny the possibility of the wise man is to transform philosophy into theology, and to deny God is necessarily to assert the possibility of man's realizing wisdom someday. Plato, who denied this possibility, saw very well that his dialectical, pedagogical, philosophical discourse could be meaningful only provided that it was theological, always being related in the final analysis to the something in Greek that I can't read, to the transcendent perfect one. And the wisdom to which this philosophy is supposed to lead is, according to the 7th letter, a conversion, which ends in a contemplation of God in silence. Aristotle, who wanted to eliminate the transcendent from Platonism and to maintain the absolute value of discourse, immediately proceeded to assert the possibility of realizing wisdom on earth. Descartes' case is even more significant because less conscious. He denies the possibility of wisdom, since he defines man by error, whereas Hegel defines him as the being that overcomes error through action. And to be able to develop his system, he must introduce from the beginning a transcendent God. The totality, that is, the circularity of the system, is not what guarantees its truth in each of its parts, but the direct relation of its parts to the single total being, that is, to God, who is thus the only guarantee of all truth. Spinoza, on the other hand, who wants to eliminate the transcendent element of Cartesianism, develops his system in a book entitled Ethics, which treats of human wisdom. Finally, Kant, in his Discovering the Transcendental, believes he can do without the transcendent, or else, what is the same, he believes he can avoid the alternative of asserting or denying wisdom by supposing an infinite or indefinite philosophical progress. But we know that this was but an illusion. To be sure, he does not need God in each of the two parts of his system, but he cannot do without God if he wants to make a system out of those two parts. That is, to unite them. Actually, he abandons the system and merely attaches the two critiques together by means of a third critique. And he knows full well that this union has the value, not of a truth, but a simple as if. In order to make this system become theological, it suffices to transform the third critique into a third part of the system. All right, continuing. In the final analysis, and speaking very generally, there are three, and only three, possible types of existential attitudes. First, One can deny the Platonic Hegelian ideal of the wise man. In other words, one can deny the supreme value is contained in self-consciousness. By deciding for this attitude, one decides against every kind of philosophy. But there is more. It must be said that, all things considered, this decision takes away the meaning of all human discourse whatsoever. In its radical form, this attitude ends in absolute silence. Therefore, first, by rejecting the ideal of wisdom, one decides against all meaningful discourse in favor of an absolute silence or a language deprived of every kind of meaning, mathematical, musical languages, and so on. Second, in accepting this ideal by denying that man can realize it, one opts for a discourse which is, to be sure, meaningful, but which relates to a reality that is essentially other than mine. One opts against philosophy for theology. Finally, third, one can opt for philosophy, but then one is forced to accept the possibility of someday realizing the ideal of wisdom. With full knowledge of the problem, Hegel opts for this third attitude, and he does not merely opt for it. In the Phenomenology, he tries to prove that it is the only possible one. Actually, he does not succeed in doing so. He cannot refute those who aspire to an existential ideal that excludes self-consciousness, or, at the very least, the indefinite extension of self-consciousness. And as for theology, he only succeeds in showing that the religious man's existence is necessarily an existence in unhappiness. But since he himself says that the religious man is satisfied by his unhappiness, he cannot refute him either, unless he appeals once more to the extension of self-consciousness. Now this extension no longer interests the religious man once he believes he has attained perfect understanding of God. In short, the Phenomenology only shows that the ideal of the wise man, as it is defined therein, is the necessary ideal of philosophy, and of every philosophy, that is, of every man who puts the supreme value on self-consciousness, which is precisely a consciousness of self and not of something else. Now, I disagree with him on here, because the point of Hegel's proof, so-called, against this is, yes, only a proof that a rational person who is doing philosophy proper, in what the sense that Kojeve is talking about here, only that person would recognize it. But this does not make the others valid at all. They're standpoints, but they're not valid standpoints for philosophy. Not as philosophy, anyways. This is what leads to stuff like existentialism and stuff like Nietzscheanism to just not be philosophy proper anymore because they give up on the project.
That's right. All post-Hegelianism is a search for a genuine finite philosophy. But if it's finite, it's not philosophy already. They always circle around some kind of gap, break, severing of the absolute from basically human reason, human thought, and so on. But in doing so, they basically annihilate their own capacity to self-instantiate as something that is real, so to speak.
They engage in a self-refuting discourse. That's the ultimate problem of all finite thinking. Not philosophy, but all finite thinking, in which Hegel can account for their positions. Whether they accept it is a completely different problem. That's a personal failure, not a failure of philosophy or reason. And people certainly don't like hearing that, but that is the case.
Is.
I mean, because to argue otherwise is to basically make an argument that truth is a standpoint that if someone is too stupid to understand reason, that somehow then they have an equally valid standpoint to the person who has reason. No, they don't. If a child is not mature enough, not intelligent enough to understand certain things, it doesn't mean the child then gets to assert their own position against yours and call it equal, because they can't. They don't have a standing. Now, they may be incapable. They may be forever an immature man-child or woman-child or whatever. They don't grow up. That's their problem, not philosophy's problem.
Yeah, I think Hegel. Yeah, there's a number of places where Hegel states that this is in terms of the dogmatic skeptic who tries to wield skepticism against philosophy proper, and who always denies their own activity of doing this by maintaining a suspension of any kind of definitive claim about even their own activity. The attitude, basically, are to be left to themselves. It's up to them to catch themselves in the act, and you can't do their thinking for them as the philosopher. So they basically have to find a way out of their own solipsism, and only they can do that.
Yep. So continuing. This restriction is by no means an objection to the phenomenology. Indeed, Hegel writes the phenomenology to answer the question, what am I? Now, the man who asks this question, that is, the man who, before continuing to live and act, wants to become conscious of himself, is by definition a philosopher. To answer the question, what am I, therefore, is necessarily to talk about the philosopher. In other words, the man with whom the phenomenology is concerned is not man simply, but the philosopher, or more exactly, the phenomenology is concerned with the various human types, only to the extent that these types are integrated in the person of the philosopher who analyzes himself in it. That is, in the person of Hegel, who wonders, what am I? No wonder then that Hegel manages to prove to the man who reads the phenomenology, and who is consequently himself a philosopher, that man as he is described in the phenomenology tends, ever more consciously, toward the ideal of wisdom, and at least realizes it. Indeed, the man who gives a complete answer to the question, what am I, is by definition a wise man. That is to say that in answering, in the strict sense of the word, the question, what am I, one necessarily answers not, I am a philosopher, but I am a wise man. Footnote 5. And the discourse of the man who knows that he is wise is no longer the phenomenology, which is still a philosophy, that is, the discourse of one who aspires to wisdom, but the finished science, that is, the encyclopedia. Continuing. Therefore, the answer to the question asked in the phenomenology is at the same time the proof of the reality of wisdom, and hence a refutation of Plato and of theology in general by fact. The whole question, therefore, is to know if the answer given at the end of the phenomenology, or more exactly by the entirety of this work, or by its first 7 chapters, is truly a total answer, an answer to all possible questions relating to human existence, and consequently to the existence of him who asked them. Now, Hegel believes that he proves the totality of the answer by its circularity. This idea of circularity is, if you will, the only original element introduced by Hegel. The definition of philosophy and wisdom that he gives or presupposes is that of all philosophers. The assertion that wisdom is realizable had already been made by Aristotle. The Stoics even asserted that wisdom was already realized, and it is more likely that certain Epicureans spoke of the wise man in the first person. However, none of these thinkers indicated a sufficient criterion for the determination of the wise man. In practice, they always settled for the fact of satisfaction, either in its subjective aspect, immobility, absence of desires, and so on, or in its objective aspect of identity to oneself, of conscious agreement with oneself, which is usually presented from the ethical point of view. But no one ever succeeded in proving that the pretender to wisdom actually realized fullness of self-consciousness. Now we have seen that without this aspect of wisdom, the ideal itself is no longer meaningful. Hegel, I believe, is the first man to find an answer, I do not say the answer, to the question of knowing whether the understanding that one has of oneself, and consequently the understanding that one has in general, is or is not total, unable to be surpassed, unable to be modified, that is, universally and definitively valid or absolutely true. According to him, this answer is given by the circularity of the understanding or knowledge. The wise man's absolute knowledge is circular, and all circular knowledge, only one such knowledge is possible, is the absolute knowledge of the wise man. To ask any question whatsoever leads sooner or later, after a longer or shorter series of answers questions, to one of the questions found within the circular knowledge that the wise man possesses. To start with this question and to proceed logically necessarily leads to the starting point. Thus it is clear that all possible questions' answers have been exhausted, or in other words, a total answer has been attained. Each part of the circular knowledge has for its answer the whole of this knowledge, which, being circular, is the entirety of all knowledge. It is known that Hegel asserted that his knowledge is circular, and that circularity is the necessary and sufficient condition of absolute truth, that is, of complete, universal, and definitive or eternal truth. But people generally forget, and only in the Phenomenology do they learn, that the conception of circularity, like every Hegelian conception, has a double aspect, an ideal, or if you will, abstract aspect, and a real, or if you will, concrete or existential aspect. And it is only the entirety of both aspects that constitutes what Hegel calls the Begriff, the concrete concept. The real aspect of the circularity of wisdom is the circular existence of the wise man. In the wise man's absolute knowledge, each question is its own answer, but is so only because he goes through the totality of questions' answers that forms the entirety of the system. Likewise, in his existence, the wise man remains in identity with himself. He is closed up in himself, but he remains in identity with himself because he passes through the totality of others, and he is closed up in himself because he closes up the totality of others in himself, which, according to the Phenomenology, means quite simply that the only man who can be wise is a citizen of the universal and homogeneous state. That is to say, the state of the Tun aller und jeder, in which each man exists only through and for the whole, and the whole exists through and for each man. Here, Kojeve's Marxism flares up. Because I don't think Hegel considers this to be the pinnacle of the wise man. The citizen is not the wise man, simpliciter. The absolute knowledge of the wise man, who realizes perfect self-consciousness, is an answer to the question, what am I? The wise man's real existence must therefore be circular. That is to say, for Hegel, he must be a citizen of the universal and homogeneous state. In order that the knowledge that reveals this existence may itself be circular, that is, an absolute truth. Therefore, only the citizen of the perfect state can realize absolute knowledge. Inversely, Hegel supposes that every man is a philosopher, that is, made so as to become conscious of what he is. At least, it is only in these men that Hegel is interested, and only of them that he speaks. A citizen of the perfect state always eventually understands himself in and by a circular, that is, absolute knowledge. This conception entails a very important consequence. Wisdom can be realized, according to Hegel, only at the end of history. Footnote 6. For according to the analysis of the Phenomenology, the state in question necessarily marks the end of the history of humanity, that is, of humanity that is self-conscious or aspires to this consciousness. All right, going back to a comment on the wise man as a citizen. This can only make sense in a Hegelian fashion insofar as the wise man is necessarily somebody who's also committed to the polity, who's committed to the state concretely as a whole. Therefore, the role of the wise man ends up being the role of the teacher, because the wise man brings forth his wisdom as a teaching to all other philosophers in this case. And, that would obviously involve a community, which, a community proper would be a state, a whole, self-conscious citizenry and polity. So, in that sense, Kojeve is right. Continuing. This, too, is universally understood. This too is universally understood. It was always known that for Hegel, not only does the coming of wisdom complete history, but also that this coming is possible only at the end of history. This is known, but why this is true is not always very well understood, and one cannot understand this as long as one does not know that the wise man must necessarily be a citizen of the universal, that is, non-expandable and homogeneous, that is, non-transformable state. And one cannot know this until one has understood that this state is nothing other than the real basis, the substructure of the circularity of the absolute system. The citizen of this state, as active citizen, realizes the circularity that he reveals as contemplative wise man through his system. Therefore, for Hegel, there is a double criterion for the realization of wisdom. On the one hand, the universality and homogeneity of the state in which the wise man lives, and on the other hand, the circularity of his knowledge. On the one hand, in the Phenomenology, Hegel has described the perfect state. No, he hasn't. Because it's not about that.
Yeah, okay. This is interesting. This gives me an understanding of how Marx misread Hegel, where, I don't know, for Hegel, it's kind of like that one little beautiful remark from Spinoza where it's like, to see history through the eyes of eternity, that's the final state. It's realizing all is in God, so to speak. So history itself was always already the end of history. It's not about like a specific material manifestation, so to speak.
Well, I wouldn't say that this is Marx's view. Marx doesn't really have anything to say about the Phenomenology, barring some small comments here and there. But this is Kojeve's Marxist interpretation of Hegel, in which Marxism is all about objective spirit, essentially. That is the absolute for them, and that's where it ends. And so Kojeve takes that standpoint here about it being essentially realized in the objective state. But anyways, continuing. In the Phenomenology, Hegel has described the perfect state. The reader need only observe the historical reality in order to see that this state is real, or at least to be convinced of its imminent realization. On the other hand, by the Phenomenology, Hegel has shown that his knowledge is circular, and that is why he believed he could assert that he actually realized in his person the ideal of all philosophy, that is, the ideal of wisdom. And for those of you who don't know much about Hegel, Hegel does state this. He doesn't call it wisdom, he calls it science, but at the beginning of the Phenomenology, he says, my goal is to transform philosophy, as the love of wisdom into science, which is knowledge or wisdom itself. So Hegel does make this distinction that he's doing something that by the regular terming conventions of philosophy, if one goes back to that ancient and all too used definition of philosophy as love of wisdom, then certainly what Hegel has achieved by the end of Phenomenology is the satisfaction of that quest, which is philosophy, and therefore is not philosophy any longer. It is something different. But of course, at the end he keeps calling it philosophy because everybody just calls it philosophy. Can't get away from it.
Yeah, it's the distinction between the coming to be of knowing and actual knowing. The term philosophy is often used interchangeably, although perhaps a distinction between philosophy and science as such would be helpful.
So what is our attitude with respect to all of this? I said that we are faced with 3, and only 3, possibilities. I believe we can eliminate the first without discussion. First, because strictly speaking, it cannot be discussed. And next, because the very fact of our study of the phenomenology proves that silent satisfaction, to which this first possibility finally reduces, does not tempt us overmuch. Therefore, only one serious dilemma remains for us. The dilemma Plato or Hegel. That is, in the final analysis, the dilemma theology or philosophy. And let me go back to footnote 8, because that looks like a gigantic footnote. That's a footnote on the wise man as citizen, revealing the state through his system. Footnote 8. Starting from this conception, we understand Hegel's attitude toward Plato. According to Hegel, Plato was right in denying the possibility of the wise man, for Plato's ideal state, which according to Hegel, moreover, merely reflects the real state of his time, is not the universal and homogeneous state. The citizen of his state, therefore, is not circular, and hence the knowledge of this citizen, which reveals his citizen's reality, is not circular either. Accordingly, the attempt to assert the possibility of the wise man within this imperfect state made it necessary to transform the very ideal of wisdom into the caricature of the Stoic and the skeptic wise man. Hegel has shown in the Phenomenology that these would-be wise men are not at all conscious of themselves, and as soon as such a wise man becomes self-conscious, he immediately sees that he does not realize perfection. He even sees that he cannot realize it, and thus it is that, becoming a Christian, he thinks that perfection has been realized outside of the world and man by God. Thus, the would-be wise man, having become a Christian, rediscovers the Platonic, or better, theological conception. But he rediscovers Plato. Therefore, he is more conscious than Plato. That is to say, he knows why he cannot be a wise man. He knows that he cannot be a wise man because the state in which he exists is not perfect. He can then have the idea of a perfect state and try to realize it. And at the moment he does this, he will become, by ceasing to be a Platonist and a Christian, a Hegelian. More exactly, he will be Hegel, the real wise man, the successful Aristotelian, Stoic, and skeptic. If you please, this is Plato again. Hegelian philosophy is a theology. However, its God is the wise man. I don't know if you met this guy, but did you ever meet a guy who went by the name of Adam? Notorious, Hegelian. He literally believed this. He literally believed that if you got to the end of the phenomenology or science of logic, you were basically like Hegel reincarnated at that moment.
Oh, okay. That guy was insane. When I first got on Discord, I got brought onto a particular server that he was on, and he was trying to haze me and stuff like that, and abuse me, and I didn't put up with it at all, and it ended up being a big controversy. He got banned, and the server felt gutted because he was a major authority on Hegel. That was nuts. If I'm thinking of the same Adam, there's this lunatic.
Yeah, he's a weird guy. It sounds like the same guy, because he believed this, and he also believed that the moment that you finish the phenomenology or the logic, you are God. You're basically equivalent of Jesus Christ, God fully reincarnated again as you. Just in concept, but you don't get the Jesus powers, but you have the knowledge. All right, now we are faced with a fact. A man who is clearly not mad, named Hegel, claims to have realized wisdom. Therefore, before deciding for or against philosophy or theology, that is, for or against the assertion of the impossibility of realizing wisdom, we must see whether or not Hegel was right in asserting that he is a wise man, whether through his very being he has not already settled once and for all the question that interests us. In order to resolve this question, we must see, 1, if the current state of things actually corresponds to what for Hegel is the perfect state and the end of history, and 2, if Hegel's knowledge is truly circular. The answer to the first question seems very easy at first sight. The perfect state? Possible, of course, but we are indeed far from it. However, at the time of writing the Phenomenology in 1806, Hegel too knew full well that the state was not yet realized indeed in all its perfection. He only asserted that the germ of this state was present in the world and that the necessary and sufficient conditions for its growth were in existence. Now, Can we with certainty deny the presence of such a germ and such conditions in our world? And even if we wanted to deny it, we would not succeed in settling once and for all the question of Hegelian wisdom. For we certainly cannot assert on the basis of attempts already made that the state in question is impossible in principle. Now, if this state is possible, wisdom is also possible, and then no need to abandon philosophy and take flight into some religion or other. Hence no need to subordinate the consciousness that I have for myself to a coming to consciousness of what I am not, of God or of some inhuman perfection, aesthetic or other, or of race, people, or nation. What then does the fact that the perfect state foreseen by Hegel is not yet ideal, not yet realized, mean for us? In these conditions, Hegel's philosophy, especially the anthropology of the phenomenology, ceases to be a truth, since it does not reveal a reality. But it is not thereby necessarily an error. It would be an error only if it could be proved that the universal and homogeneous state that he has in view is impossible. But this cannot be proved. Now, what is neither an error nor a truth is an idea, or if you prefer, an ideal. This idea can be transformed into truth only by negating action, which will destroy the world that does not correspond to the idea, and will create by this very destruction the world in conformity with the ideal. In other words, one can accept the anthropology of the phenomenology, even with the knowledge that the perfect man, the wise man with whom it is finally concerned, is not yet realized, only on the condition that one wants to act with a view to the realization of the Hegelian state that is indispensable to the existence of this man, to act or at least to accept and justify such an action. It is done by someone, somewhere. However, this by no means exempts us from studying the second Hegelian criterion, that of circularity. Still less, given that it is infinitely more important than the first. In the first case, end of history, perfect state. What is involved is a verification of fact, that is to say, of something essentially uncertain. In the second, circularity, what is involved is a logical, rational analysis in which no divergence of opinion is possible. Accordingly, if we see that Hegel's system actually is circular, we must conclude, in spite of appearances, and perhaps even in spite of common sense, that history is completed, and consequently that the state in which this system could be realized is the perfect state. This, by the way, is what Hegel himself did, as we know. After the fall of Napoleon, he declared that the Prussian state, which in other respects he detests, was the definitive or perfect state, and he could not do otherwise, given that he was convinced of the circularity of his system. Therefore, the whole question for us reduces to this. If the phenomenology is actually circular, we must accept it outright, along with everything that follows from it. If it is not, we must consider it as a hypothetical deductive whole, and verify all the hypotheses and deductions one by one. One must begin, therefore, by studying the phenomenology. There's a footnote before that. Footnote 9. Moreover, it is not sufficient that the phenomenology be circular. The logic or the encyclopedia must be so too. And what is much more important, the system in its entirety, that is to say, the entirety of the phenomenology in the encyclopedia, must also be circular. Now, it is precisely there that the non-circularity of Hegel's system is perfectly obvious. But here I can say so only in passing without proof. One must begin, therefore, by studying the phenomenology from the point of view of its circularity. However, before doing this, one must, 1, know what this requirement of circularity means, and 2, understand whether truly true, absolute truth can only be circular. All right, and that's where that ends.
Nice.
Definitely some obvious disagreements, but otherwise, when he's right, he's right.
Yeah, there's some really great stuff. That section with the 3 points in a row concerning the wise man was wonderful. And it's also, this has been really, I learned a lot here about how influential Kojeve was on interpretation of Hegel, and understanding of Hegel, following, this is still, lots of connections I wouldn't have made before between what people think and say about Hegel versus what Hegel said and stuff are kind of being fleshed out here, where Kojeve was enormously influential on people's readings of Hegel.
Yes, certainly. I mean, his emphasis on the state is definitely there in many people's receptions. Although, just like his thing about the wise man can only exist in the perfect state, for example. It's a yes and no, as I conceive this. It's a yes in that only with the historical conditions give rise to a general society in which the philosopher can exist, observant of at least the germ, the arising of the elements of the proper state. Can this system, can Hegelian philosophy properly come to arise? And that means not only, just people think about the state as only political state. No, this includes stuff like economics. There's people who look at the historical conditions and say that part of the arising of the dynamism of theories of evolution, for example, Hegel's dynamism of logic and whatnot, that part of what causes or what enables this to become a part of consciousness is the immense dynamism of capital. That the way that capital just forces things to gear into an incessant change, which just keeps accelerating, makes it near impossible for a properly conscious person, in a philosophical sense, properly self-conscious person, to not become aware of this dynamism of being, and therefore incorporating that into the dynamism of their own thought. So in that sense, yes, the wise man needs at least the elements of the perfect state to be existent, even if they are not fully together. In another sense, it's not true, because in the sense the wise man is Plato, the wise man is Aristotle. They were wise in their own time. They attained truth to the extent that it was true in their own time, to the extent that the concept was existent. And they were satisfied by that. Clearly they remained unsatisfied on various things because they couldn't have access to the absolute, but they did have access to truth. And to that certain extent, they were satisfied. They were self-conscious, and they do fit within the discourse of wisdom rather than just philosophy. So the wise man and the philosopher exist on a continuum, in which to be a philosopher is just to be an incomplete wise man, by this conception that he has. The other things that he brought up a few times in this essay, or these lectures, pointing out to the empirical fact, as somehow being necessary for these things to be true. Not necessarily. In the highest sense, yes, but it's not to prove the concept true, but it's rather to prove reality true through the concept. It's the inverse of what he's thinking. He's kind of taking the materialist bias here, that it is reality that confirms the truth of our concepts, rather than our concepts confirming the truth of reality. So he's wrong on that. Well, he's misinterpreting on that count, for sure, because Hegel doesn't care. There is a famous phrase. It's falsely attributed, but it's pretty much in the spirit of Hegel. If there's a divergence between theory and facts, so much worse for the facts. But Hegel really is kind of that way. If there's a divergence between the truth of our true concepts, all concepts necessarily are true as concepts at least, and the empirical world, then it's the empirical world that's false, not our concepts. Our concepts, if we think them properly, cannot fail to be true. So Hegel's not afraid for truth on that level. second is the necessity of the actuality of lived circularity versus philosophical circularity. That also doesn't jive properly. There is a link, but that link is not one-to-one. That if there is one, there's going to be the other. But if one is not complete, particularly the objective material side, so to say, that doesn't mean that the philosophical side is not thereby capable of its own completion, even if it is incomplete. I'm actually interested to know why he thinks the encyclopedia is incomplete. I have ideas from my view of why the encyclopedia is incomplete. It is circular, properly circular. It's just, it has gaps in the details. The general structure is complete. I have no doubts about that. It's just certain details in certain portions which I think certainly can be filled in now at a much greater consideration, and perhaps adding a bit of conceptual detail which was not there before. But beyond that, the circularity is very much provable, in my opinion, and can be confirmed. But all right, this was a good reading. Thanks for joining me, and for those of you listening, hope you enjoyed it as well. See you around.